dropping a tray of champagne flutes on a Bay Street hedge fund manager usually ended a catering career on the spot. The night Olive Maguire did it to Rémy Cloutier, it merely ended with her getting hired. That was the part nobody could explain. Not Olive, not the pale-faced events manager who stood frozen by the entrance watching 12 crystal glasses explode across imported Italian marble, and certainly not the two men in dark suits flanking Rémy Cloutier who had their hands inside their jackets before the first piece of glass hit the floor. Olive Maguire was 26 years old, 5'4", and generously built in the way that made department store blazers a personal enemy. She had grown up in Sudbury, Ontario, the youngest of 4 kids, in a house where the furnace gave up every February, and the grocery budget was a serious weekly negotiation. She had moved to Toronto at 22, with a community college diploma in office administration, a second-hand suitcase held together by a bungee cord, and a talent for finding the one loose floorboard in any room she walked into. The catering gig was her 3rd job of the week. She also answered phones at a physiotherapy clinic on Tuesday mornings and delivered meal kits on weekends in a car that made a sound like a dying accordion whenever she took a left turn. The agency had sent her to the Cloutier Group's private charity auction at the Yorkville estate because the regular girl had called in sick, and Olive had never once turned down a shift. She had been navigating a full tray of vintage Veuve Clicquot through a crowd of people wearing more money than she would earn in 5 years when the heel of her sensible black flat caught the raised edge of a decorative floor vent. What happened next was not graceful. The tray went one direction, Olive went another, and the champagne made its own catastrophic decision entirely, landing in a cascading golden waterfall directly across the chest and lapels of the most quietly dangerous-looking man in the room. Rémy Cloutier did not flinch. He stood perfectly still while $1,200 worth of champagne soaked through his charcoal Tom Ford suit. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that had clearly decided somewhere around 40 that it was finished being warm to strangers. Silver threaded through dark hair at his temples. His jaw was the kind that portrait artists painted on men who had never, in their entire lives, been told no. The room went very quiet. Olive was on her knees in the debris, reflexively gathering broken stems of crystal with her bare hands. "Oh, holy moly," she breathed into the floor more to herself than anyone. "Oh no. Oh, I am so sorry. I am genuinely, catastrophically sorry. I caught the vent. The decorative vent. Who puts a decorative vent there?" She looked up, her face flushed a color somewhere between embarrassment and cardiac event, and found herself looking directly at Rémy Cloutier's expression, which was unreadable in the way that very expensive safes were unreadable. The two men in dark suits had materialized at his shoulders like shadows gaining weight. "Put your hands down," one of them said, low and flat. "Don't touch the glass." "Right. Yes, right. Glass, hands. Absolutely." Olive sat back on her heels and pressed her hands to her thighs instead. One of her fingers was bleeding slightly from a small cut she hadn't noticed getting. "I am going to pay for the dry cleaning. I want you to know that. It'll take me approximately 4 months, but I will absolutely do it." Someone in the crowd laughed nervously. Rémy Cloutier's expression didn't change. He looked down at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the man to his right. "Get her name from the agency," he said. "I need a new executive assistant." The man blinked. "Boss, her filing." "Is it any good?" Rémy asked, still looking at Olive. Olive blinked back. "My filing? You have an office admin diploma. The agency sends me your placement profile before any event you work. I read them. It's a habit." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded white pocket square, which he used to wipe champagne from his watch without breaking eye contact. 92 words per minute, it says. Digital filing systems, bilingual correspondence, bookkeeping software. A pause. "Can you make coffee without incident?" "That is genuinely 50-50, Olive said honestly. Something moved across Rémy Cloutier's face. Not a smile. Not quite, but something adjacent to one, brief and quickly buried. "Then we'll consider the espresso machine your final interview," he said, and walked away. The Cloutier Group occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Bay Street, and it was, on paper, a mid-size private equity and logistics firm with interests in port operations, commercial real estate, and import distribution across Quebec and Ontario. Off paper, it was the financial nerve center of the most organized and quietly influential criminal network operating between Montreal and Thunder Bay, a network that had existed under various names and family arrangements since the 1970s, and that Rémy Cloutier had inherited from his uncle at 38 and rebuilt from near collapse through a combination of ruthless efficiency, personal loyalty, and the kind of patience that most people confused with coldness. Olive did not know any of this on her first Monday morning. She knew the coffee machine was Italian, complicated, and had a panel of buttons that suggested it was also capable of filing tax returns. She knew the executive floor had a carpet so thick it felt like walking on a sleeping dog. She knew that the two men who had been at the charity event, the one with the flat voice and the one who never seemed to speak at all, were apparently always here, positioned at a slight remove from wherever Rémy was, and that everyone called the flat-voiced one Arsenio, and no one called the quiet one anything at all. She also knew that on her first morning, navigating the espresso machine with the focus of a person diffusing something, she caught her elbow on the steam wand, sent the portafilter spinning off the counter, and managed to produce a single perfect double shot, which she considered a moderate miracle and her greatest personal achievement since parallel parking in downtown Sudbury. Rémy looked at the espresso, looked at her, looked back at the espresso. "The files on the left," he said. "Separate the Marquette accounts from the Beausoleil correspondence. Don't open anything that isn't already labeled." "Understood." She turned to go. "Maguire." She stopped. "You have a cut on your right index finger. There's a first aid kit in the kitchen cabinet above the microwave. Use it before you touch the paper files." She looked at her finger, the small cut from the broken champagne glass, which she had completely forgotten about. "Oh, thank you." He had already looked back down at his work. That was the beginning of it, not the champagne disaster, not the espresso, but that small, specific detail, the cut on her finger. In Olive's experience, the people who employed her did not notice things like that. She lasted the first week, which apparently nobody expected. Arsenio told her this on Thursday afternoon while she was reorganizing the physical archive room, a project she had started without being asked, because the existing system made no chronological sense and it was making her eye twitch. 4 assistants in 8 months, he said from the doorway, watching her with his arms crossed. He had the kind of face that had seen a great deal and found most of it unsurprising. 1. Lasted 11 days. She quit by email at 2 in the morning. "What happened to the others?" Olive asked, not looking up from a stack of folders she was relabeling. They asked questions they weren't supposed to ask. Olive thought about the duffel bag she had found wedged behind the filing cabinet that morning when she was reorganizing, the one that was clearly quite heavy and that she had simply relocated to the storage closet without comment because it was in the way of the folders and it was not her business. "I'm a professional," she said. "I file things. I make coffee. I answer phones." Arsenio was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not easy to work for." "No one who owns a Tom Ford suit is easy to work for," Olive said. "I grew up sharing a bedroom with 3 older brothers in Sudbury. I have a high tolerance for difficult." Arsenio made a sound that might, in different circumstances, have been a laugh. By the second week, she had found a discrepancy. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been cross-referencing shipping invoices from the Marquette account, a series of import contracts related to restaurant supply distribution across northern Ontario. Because the totals in the filing system didn't match the figures in the bookkeeping software, and mismatched numbers made Olive physically uncomfortable in the way a crooked picture frame made other people uncomfortable. The difference was not small. Someone called D. Vachon, listed as a freight broker out of Sault-Ste-Marie, had been systematically overbilling the Cloutier Group's restaurant supply contracts by 11% for at least 14 months. The total difference was a number with 6 figures. She did the math twice. Then she made a note. Then she knocked on Rémy's office door. He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her. She waited. He finished the call and looked at her with the expression he used as a default, which was the human equivalent of a door that was firmly but politely closed. "The Marquette invoices don't reconcile," she said, and put the annotated spreadsheet on his desk. "Someone named Vachon has been skimming freight costs. I can't tell if it was intentional or a billing error, but the pattern's pretty consistent. So." She shrugged. Rémy looked at the spreadsheet. He did not move for approximately 10 seconds, which was long enough that Olive started wondering if she'd done something wrong. "This Vachon," he said, very quietly. "You're certain? The numbers are right there." "Numbers don't trip over their own feet," she tapped the column. "I flagged all 14 months. You can verify against the original invoices if you want. I've pulled them." Rémy set the paper down. He looked at her with something that was not quite the default closed-door expression. "My own accounting firm has reviewed these accounts twice in the last year. Your accounting firm wasn't refiling them chronologically and comparing them line by line to the software totals," Olive said. "They were probably just spot-checking the summaries." A pause. "I have a thing about numbers not matching. My mum used to say it bordered on a disorder. Something moved in Rémy's jaw, not displeasure. Something else. Leave the Vachon files with me," he said. "I will handle it." The following Tuesday, D. Vachon's name no longer appeared anywhere in the Cloutier group's system. Olive did not ask what had happened. She reorganized the gap in the files and moved on. There was a morning in the third week when Rémy came in 40 minutes late, which had apparently never happened because Arsenio texted her. "He's not in yet. Don't call him," before she had even noticed. When Rémy did appear, his shirt was immaculate, but something behind his eyes was not, and he sat at his desk for 15 minutes without opening a single file. Olive brought him a coffee she hadn't been asked for. She set it down. She did not say anything. She turned to leave. "My sister's youngest," he said, to no one in particular. "He's been sick. It's been a difficult few months." Olive stopped. "I'm sorry," she meant it plainly, the way she'd learned to in Sudbury, where sentiment didn't get dressed up because there wasn't time. Rémy was quiet. Then, "You have siblings, 3 brothers, older." She leaned against the doorframe. "2 of them are great. One of them is a project." She paused. "The sick ones are the hardest, not because of what they need, because of what you can't fix." Rémy looked at the window. Outside, November in Toronto was doing its grey and gusty worst against the glass. "Yes," he said after a moment. "That's exactly it." She left him to the coffee and the grey window and did not make a performance of the moment, which was, she would later think, probably the right call. He brought her a box of butter tarts from a bakery in Kensington Market the next morning, left it on her desk without explanation. When she knocked on his door to thank him, he was already on a call and waved her off. She ate 3 of them before noon and hid the box in the filing room, because Arsenio had a habit of helping himself to her snacks, and she wasn't sharing these. Olive had been with the Cloutier group for 5 weeks when the reality of exactly what it was became impossible to set aside. She had been assembling records gradually, not deliberately, not with any agenda, but the way a person assembles a picture from peripheral details when they spend enough time in a room. The men who came and went from the executive floor and spoke in low voices and left without signing anything. The port operations files that had invoices she could reconcile and other invoices that she quickly understood were not meant to be reconciled. The phone calls Rémy took standing at the window with his back to the room, his voice dropping to a register that had nothing to do with private equity logistics. She was eating lunch at her desk on a Wednesday, a Tupperware of leftover pasta from Sunday, because the sandwich place downstairs was $8, and her budget disagreed with that, when she overheard 2 of the men in the small boardroom. She wasn't trying to. The door was slightly open, and she was right there. What they were discussing was not restaurant supply distribution. She ate the rest of her pasta very carefully and stared at her screen and thought, okay. She thought about her lease, which she could now actually make without the meal kit deliveries. She thought about the physiotherapy clinic, which she had quietly dropped because she didn't need the Tuesday morning money anymore. She thought about calling her mum, She thought about the cut on her index finger and the butter tarts and the way Rémy had said that's exactly it to the grey November window. She thought, I should probably quit. She was still thinking about it when Rémy came out of his office and paused at her desk, which was unusual because he didn't generally pause at her desk. You heard the meeting, he said. It wasn't a question. Olive looked at him. The door was open. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Do you want to leave? It was not phrased as a question either, quite. Olive put the lid on her Tupperware. The filing is finally in order, she said. If I leave now, whoever comes next will just destroy it in a week, and you'll be back to unsorted quarterly mess. A pause. I'd find that very stressful. Rémy said nothing for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't quite name. You should go home on time tonight, he said. Take a car from the company account. Don't walk to the subway. Okay, she said. She understood, from that point forward, that the car was not a perk. It was a Tuesday in December, cold enough that the harbour was considering freezing when they took her. She had been on her lunch break. She absolutely knew, that she was not supposed to leave the building alone, that Arsenio had explained this twice, that the car was available whenever she needed it. But the kitchen on the executive floor was out of the specific brand of sparkling water she had developed an attachment to since switching from the $8 sandwiches, and there was a grocery store literally 1 block away, and she would be 12 minutes, maximum. She got the sparkling water. She came out of the store into the late afternoon, dark of Toronto in December, and she was looking at her phone because she was texting her brother Cormac, the project brother, about Christmas dinner, and she did not see the black SUV until it was already stopped beside her and the door was opening. It happened very fast. A hand on her arm, another at her shoulder. She was heavy and she knew it and she used it. Dug her heels into the salted sidewalk, swung her elbow back with the water bottle still in her hand and caught someone in the teeth with the corner of it, heard a genuine yelp. But there were 3 of them and she was one, and it wasn't enough. The inside of the SUV smelled like stale coffee and synthetic air freshener. She did not scream. She was from Sudbury. Screaming was for when screaming would help. She woke up in a warehouse. She knew it was a warehouse because the ceiling was corrugated metal. And very high, and the cold came through the walls in waves, and somewhere water was dripping with the patient regularity of something that had been dripping for years. Her wrists were zip-tied behind her to the chair she was sitting on, which was cheap and plastic and felt. She noted with the part of her brain that never quite turned off, like it was not rated for her weight. She's awake. The man standing across from her was not memorable looking, which was probably deliberate. Mid-40s, expensive coat over cheap energy, the face of someone who had decided at some point that cruelty was a shortcut to power and hadn't revisited that decision since. He introduced himself as Patenaude. He said it like she should know the name. She didn't. You work for Rémy Cloutier, Patenaude said. He was walking a slow circle around her chair. And Rémy Cloutier has been very uncooperative lately with regard to the port access agreements. We thought perhaps a more personal form of communication might help clarify his priorities. I answer his phones and organize his files, Olive said. Her voice was admirably steady, she thought, given everything. I'm not sure I'm the clearest signal you could send. Word is he fired a man last month for speaking badly about you in the break room. Patenaude stopped walking. Word is he hasn't looked at anyone the way he looks at you in a very long time. Olive filed this information away to experience a feeling about later if there was a later. He won't negotiate with you, she said. I don't know what he will do, but it won't be negotiate. Patenaude smiled without warmth and dialed his phone. It rang twice. The voice that answered was so quiet it took up all the space in the room. Patenaude, Rémy said. That was all, just the name. But the way he said it suggested he had already made several decisions and was currently implementing them. Your little secretary is with us, Patenaude said pleasantly. We're going to have a conversation about the lakeshore terminals. You and I, cooperative conversation this time. A pause. Let me speak to her, Rémy said. Patenaude held the phone toward Olive's face. I'm fine, she said immediately. I'm in a warehouse, my wrists are zip-tied. And there's a man here named Patternord who doesn't know what he's doing. Don't give him anything, Rémy. I mean it. I'm a liability with a sparkling water addiction. Just tell him to keep me. Olive. Her name in his mouth was not the way her name usually sounded. It was different in a way she didn't have a word for yet, something pressed down and barely contained. Are you hurt? No. Then, honestly, there's a chair situation I'm a bit worried about. I'm coming, he said. Not to her, exactly. Not to Patternord. Just as a fact, stated plainly, the way someone states that it is currently raining or that a door is closed. Don't let anyone touch her again. Patternord laughed, but his hands, Olive noticed, had gone very slightly still. She had been counting things. The dripping. The guards. The exits she could see from her chair. Loading dock doors to the left, a regular door to the right that led somewhere, a high transom window that was not relevant to her situation, but that she noted anyway. There were 2 guards visible, one near the loading dock, one near Patternord. The chair was the variable. Olive had spent 26 years apologizing for the space her body took up. She had spent 26 years navigating a world that was sized for someone about 60 pounds lighter and had sharp corners everywhere. She had, in the process, developed an extremely accurate understanding of load-bearing capacity. This chair was not going to survive her doing what she was thinking about doing. She waited. She waited until Patternord was on his phone, turned partly away. And the guard near him was watching Patternord, and the guard near the loading dock was looking at the loading dock doors for some reason, and then she threw herself backward with every pound she had. The chair made a sound like a starter pistol when it hit the concrete. The backrest shattered completely. Olive hit the floor, and the impact knocked the breath out of her in one great gust, but the broken backrest had taken the zip ties with it, and when she wrenched her wrists apart, the tie snapped loose. The guard near the loading dock was already running at her. She grabbed the closest thing, which was a length of rusty pipe lying in a pile of construction debris, and she was not aiming. She was purely flailing with the commitment of someone who had no other options, and the pipe caught him. She was still not entirely sure how, directly in the knee. He went down hard, the loading dock door behind him absorbing the rest of his momentum. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said automatically, which was insane and also completely honest. She was on her feet. She did not have a plan. She had a pipe and exit, and she was moving toward the door on the right when the loading dock doors across the warehouse exploded inward. Not metaphorically. An actual vehicle, black and armored, came through them at speed, and the warehouse filled with cold air and sound, and very shortly afterward, Rémy Cloutier. He was not wearing a jacket. He had a vest on over his shirt, and he moved through the room like the room had no business existing around him, and the men who tried to put themselves in his path found they had made a significant miscalculation. Arsenio was behind him with 2 others, and it was clinical and efficient, and over-fast in the way that things are over-fast when they were always going to end one particular way. Patternord tried to run. He got as far as the far wall before Rémy caught him. What happened after that was brief and total, and Olive deliberately looked at the door she was still holding, instead of at it. Then the room was quiet except for the dripping and the cold and her own breathing. Olive. She turned. Rémy was standing 6 feet away. He was looking at her the way she had never quite seen him look at anything, like he had been holding his breath since December and had just remembered how to stop. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He crossed the distance between them and his hands came up to her face, and it was different from the Dante scene that this story was not. Because Rémy Cloutier was not a man who did things dramatically. His hands were very careful. His thumbs found the edge of her jaw and he looked at her face like he was checking an inventory of something he hadn't known he needed until he'd come very close to not having it. "Your wrists," he said. She looked. There were marks from the zip ties, red and abraded. "I'm fine. You broke the chair." "It broke first," she said. "I just participated." Something moved through him. She felt it in his hands, a kind of held-in release, a season's worth of controlled distance, finally giving up on itself. He pulled her in slowly, one arm across her shoulders, the other at the back of her head, and he held on. She felt his face in her hair and his chest against her cheek, and the uneven exhale of a man who had been running on adrenaline and rage for the last hour, and was only now accepting that it was over. She wrapped her arms around him. He was solid and warm and smelled like cold air and cedar, and whatever disciplined and dangerous world he had been living in, since long before she tripped over a champagne tray in Yorkville. "I told you not to go out alone," he said into her hair. "Quiet, not an accusation." "I know," she said. "I wanted sparkling water." A pause. "In my defense, I hit someone with the bottle before they got me in the car." He made a sound against her hair. It was rough and rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. She had heard that sound once before, in his office, when she'd said, "Numbers don't trip over their own feet," and she had thought at the time that she wanted to hear it again. She heard it again. January came in cold and certain. The Lakeshore Terminal business got resolved in ways Olive didn't ask about and didn't need to know. Arsenio started leaving her coffee already made on the days she was running behind. The quiet one, she'd finally learned his name was Fen, held the elevator and sometimes, not always but sometimes, gave her a brief nod that she had decided counted as warmth in the currency of people like him. Paternard's name stopped appearing in the relevant conversations. The gap in the files where his name had been was reorganized and relabeled and moved to archive. Rémy still didn't say things directly, as a rule. He brought her a good winter coat, just appeared on the hook by her desk one morning. No tag, no explanation, the right size, which should not have been as moving as it was. He adjusted the office temperature without being asked. He moved a meeting once because she had mentioned offhand that her youngest niece had a school thing she'd wanted to go to, and he'd simply moved the meeting, and she'd come back from Sudbury for the weekend, and found her desk reorganized in her absence, which was unsettling, but also, she'd decided, affectionate in its way. She had stopped thinking about quitting somewhere around week 4. She had stopped pretending she didn't know why somewhere around the warehouse. It was a Thursday evening in late January when she was the last one on the floor, finishing the quarterly consolidation, and Rémy came out of his office at 8:30 with his coat over his arm and stopped when he saw her still there. He looked at her in the specific way he had, the one she had learned to read like a frequency. He set his coat down on the chair nearest the door. He sat on the edge of her desk, which he had never done. He was close enough that she could have touched him without reaching. "You understand what's is," he said. "What I am, what the work is." "Yes," she said. "And you're still here, Rémy." She said his name the way she'd been saying it in her head for weeks, which was different from how she said it out loud at work. "I'm from Sudbury. I'm not naive about how things work. I'm not here because I'm naive." "Then why?" She looked at him directly. "Because you noticed the cut on my finger. Because you moved a meeting for my niece's school play. Because when your nephew was sick and you couldn't fix it, you actually said so, to me, out loud. And I think that probably cost you something." She paused. "And because I am very tired of being in rooms where I'm the thing people look past." He was quiet for a moment. The city was very dark beyond the glass and the Bay Street lights were on, and the whole building was empty except for the two of them. "You are not something anyone in this office looks past," he said. "I would not permit it." She knew that. She had known it since the capo had been gone by Tuesday. "I know," she said. He reached out and covered her hand with his. "Not a performance, just a fact. Outside, Toronto was cold and dark and indifferent, the way large cities were in winter. And inside the 32nd floor of a glass tower on Bay Street, Olive Maguire, who had tripped over an ornamental vent at a Yorkville charity auction and accidentally ended up at the center of the most dangerous man's world in the city, was, for the first time in a long time, entirely certain she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She still jammed the espresso machine twice a week. She still caught her elbow on the doorframe to the boardroom, with a frequency that had become a kind of office landmark. She still apologized to the filing cabinet when she bumped into it. Nobody laughed. Not anymore. Because Olive Maguire was no longer just the clumsy woman who had soaked Rémy Cloutier's suit with champagne. She was the one person in his carefully controlled world who moved through it without fear and without pretense. And he had quietly, completely rearranged the entire thing around making sure she stayed.